By the early 1960s, China had re-emerged as a significant force in global affairs, a nuclear-capable communist state with enormous reserves of human capital and economic potential, yet one still reeling from the catastrophic policy failures of its recent past. The ruinous miscalculations of the Great Leap Forward had temporarily sidelined Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong from day-to-day governance. But his influence remained pervasive and his ambitions undiminished. Working quietly to reassert himself, Mao oversaw the publication in 1964 of a slim volume of political aphorisms that would become one of the most widely distributed books in human history. Commonly known as the Little Red Book, it distilled Maoist ideology into 427 concise quotations intended to be memorized and carried by every citizen in the country. Over the following decade, more than 1 billion copies were printed, a circulation surpassed only by the Bible. The book served both as an ideological primer and as the opening move in Mao's calculated return to the center of Chinese political life. In 1966, he made that return explicit and dramatic. Convinced that revolutionary fervor was flagging and that hidden reactionaries had infiltrated the Communist Party itself, Mao called for a sweeping cultural revolution, a campaign of radical renewal aimed at purging old thought, old culture, old customs, and old habits from Chinese society. He framed the struggle in urgent, almost apocalyptic terms, insisting that the revolutionary project required perpetual momentum and that complacency was itself a form of betrayal. To enforce his vision, Mao relied on a network of loyal allies, most notably Defense Minister Lin Biao, who commanded the military, and his wife Jiang Qing, a former actress who wielded extensive influence over state media and cultural institutions. The campaign found immediate and enthusiastic support among students and young people, who organized themselves into paramilitary units called Red Guards, identifiable by their red armbands and ubiquitous copies of Mao's collected sayings. Millions converged on Beijing, where Mao received them at mass rallies in Tiananmen Square, legitimizing their mission and unleashing their energy upon the country. The Red Guards turned first on their own teachers and university professors, identifying them as symbols of the old order. Beatings, public humiliations, and forced self-criticisms became routine. Jiang Qing encouraged the violence openly, and within weeks the chaos had spread far beyond university campuses to engulf entire cities and provinces. Roving mobs, sometimes numbering in the thousands, targeted anyone deemed insufficiently revolutionary, the literate, the traditionally educated, those with foreign connections, or simply those unfortunate enough to be denounced by a neighbor or a rival. The so-called struggle sessions, in which victims were subjected to public torture, humiliation, and denunciation, often led by their own friends or relatives acting under duress, became a defining horror of the period. Vast quantities of books, artworks, temples, and monuments associated with pre-communist China were systematically destroyed. On the occasion of his 73rd birthday in December 1966, Mao called explicitly for all-round civil war within the party, ordering the replacement of existing officials with revolutionary committees composed exclusively of his loyalists. The military was directed to support the purges, inaugurating a far bloodier phase of the campaign. Estimates suggest that in 1967 alone, approximately 250,000 people were killed and 750,000 left with permanent disabilities. The following year brought yet another campaign, the cleansing of class ranks, which subjected a further 30 million people to struggle sessions and extended the terror to every corner of society and every age group without exception. Jiang Qing, by this point among the most feared figures in the country, sat at the center of a radical inner circle that would later be identified collectively as the Gang of Four. Alongside political theorist Zhang Chunqiao, literary critic Yao Wenyuan, and labor organizer Wang Hongwen. Together they controlled much of the state's propaganda apparatus, from newspapers and radio broadcasts to the revolutionary theater and opera productions that had displaced traditional cultural forms across China. The violence reached into the highest ranks of the party itself. Liu Shaoqi, China's head of state, was dragged before struggle sessions along with members of his family, beaten by Red Guards and eventually imprisoned, where he died in 1969, a broken man stripped of every shred of dignity and authority. Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatist and reformer who sat on the Politburo Standing Committee, was purged and dispatched to labor in a tractor factory in a distant province. The suffering extended to those closest to him. His brother was driven to suicide, and his son was tortured by Red Guards and thrown from a third-floor window, an act that left him paralyzed for life. Among the many other senior officials caught up in the purges was Xi Zhongxun, whose son would go on to lead China decades later as President Xi Jinping. Premier Zhou Enlai managed to survive by navigating the political treachery with extraordinary discipline, publicly endorsing the persecution of former colleagues rather than risking open dissent, a calculated strategy of political survival that preserved his position but came at considerable moral cost. His relationship with Mao was fundamentally unequal. Mao resented Zhou's popularity with both the public and the party, even as he depended on him to keep the government functioning and to manage China's increasingly complex foreign policy. Mao had named Lin Biao, not Zhou, as his designated successor, but that relationship too deteriorated over time into mutual suspicion and barely concealed hostility. In 1971, convinced that his position had become untenable and that his life was at risk, Lin Biao attempted to flee to the Soviet Union with members of his family, only for his aircraft to crash in Mongolia, killing everyone on board. The elimination of Lin Biao led to subsequent purges of his former allies within the People's Liberation Army, and Zhou Enlai's standing within the leadership rose considerably as a result. With the worst of the Red Guard violence wound down by Mao's own directive in 1968, the Guards, having served their destabilizing purpose, and with the Lin Biao episode resolved, Zhou was positioned to pursue a series of consequential foreign policy achievements that further strengthened his reputation and popular standing. Among the most significant was China's formal admission to the United Nations in 1971. Since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, China's seat at the UN had been occupied by the nationalist government that had retreated to Taiwan and reconstituted itself as the Republic of China. After years of sustained diplomatic effort, the UN General Assembly voted to transfer recognition, along with the Permanent Security Council seat that accompanied it, to the People's Republic on the mainland, representing a major symbolic and strategic victory for Beijing. Simultaneously, Zhou worked to engineer a carefully managed rapprochement with the United States. Relations between the two governments had been completely frozen since 1949, but the thaw began in 1971 with an invitation extended to the American table tennis team to tour China, a choreographed diplomatic overture that became widely known as ping-pong diplomacy. Zhou personally welcomed the American athletes and, with his characteristic political subtlety, reportedly suggested that the dominant Chinese team refrain from winning every match. The gesture was widely interpreted as a success and laid the groundwork for a formal state visit by President Richard Nixon in 1972. Nixon, despite his well-documented hostility toward communism throughout his career, recognized that improved relations with China offered meaningful strategic leverage against the Soviet Union, a calculation that his Chinese counterparts shared entirely. The visit resulted in the lifting of a trade embargo that had been in place since the communist consolidation of power in 1949, inaugurating a new phase in the relationship between the world's two most consequential nations. Deng Xiaoping, meanwhile, was rehabilitated in 1973 at the encouragement of Zhou and permitted to return to Beijing from internal exile in Jiangxi province. By 1974, he had been restored to the position of vice premier, working alongside Zhou on foreign affairs and the practical administration of the state. The political climate, however, remained deeply unstable. The Gang of Four, recognizing Deng and Zhou as threats to their influence and to the preservation of Mao's ideological legacy, turned the state propaganda apparatus against them with full force, characterizing them as counter-revolutionary rightists and working systematically to undermine their authority and public standing. Mao, increasingly preoccupied with his own historical legacy and susceptible to the gang's framing, appeared at various points to endorse their efforts. Zhou Enlai had been diagnosed with cancer, but credible accounts suggest that Mao intervened to obstruct timely medical treatment, a reflection of his deep ambivalence toward a man he simultaneously needed and felt threatened by. Zhou died in January 1976. As premier since the founding of the People's Republic, he had been one of the central architects of Communist China, diplomat, administrator, and the most effective moderating influence on Mao's more destructive tendencies, however constrained that influence ultimately proved to be. His death provoked an extraordinary and spontaneous outpouring of public grief that alarmed the authorities. On April 4th, large crowds gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn Zhou and to express barely veiled protest against what many perceived as the Gang of Four's deliberate campaign to tarnish his memory. The following day, security forces cleared the square and made approximately 40 arrests. Deng Xiaoping was accused of having orchestrated the unrest and was removed from his official positions for the second time. In the months that followed, a powerful typhoon struck Henan province, causing the catastrophic collapse of dozens of dams, many constructed during the Great Leap Forward, and producing floods that destroyed millions of homes across the region. The authorities moved swiftly to suppress coverage of the disaster. Official figures acknowledged around 26,000 deaths, though later estimates have placed the true toll at several times that number. The catastrophe served as a grim and timely reminder of how ideologically motivated infrastructure projects had translated into enduring human tragedy. Mao Zedong died in September 1976 at the age of 82, having dominated Chinese political life for more than a quarter century. The country observed a week of national mourning, and over 1 million people passed through the Great Hall of the People to pay their respects as Mao lay in state. To the overwhelming majority of Chinese citizens, he remained a towering and almost mythic figure, the leader who had unified a fragmented nation, expelled foreign imperial influence, and established China as a sovereign power of genuine international consequence. Yet his record was inseparable from catastrophe on a historic scale. The agricultural collectivization policies of the Great Leap Forward had produced the largest famine in recorded history, killing tens of millions of people in just a few years. The Cultural Revolution had subjected enormous numbers of innocent people to violence, imprisonment, torture, and death, while obliterating an incalculable portion of China's accumulated cultural heritage and leaving psychological wounds that would persist across generations. Chinese society in the immediate aftermath of Mao's death was regimented, deeply traumatized, and corroded by pervasive social distrust, its institutions hollowed out and its educated class decimated by a decade of deliberate persecution. Mao's chosen successor, Hua Guofen, was a capable but uninspiring official who lacked the personal authority or political stature to command the party's deeply fractious factions on his own terms. His stated position, that whatever Mao had decided must be defended and whatever Mao had directed must be obeyed, reflected both genuine ideological loyalty and a careful reading of what political survival required. In practice, however, Hua moved decisively against the Gang of Four, whom he and much of the senior leadership held accountable for the Cultural Revolution's worst excesses. On October 6, 1976, barely a month after Mao's death, the gang were arrested. At a subsequent televised trial, Jiang Qing mounted a defiant and entirely unrepentant defense of her actions, but all four were convicted of counter-revolutionary crimes. She and Jiang Chunchao received death sentences, though both were eventually commuted to life imprisonment. Jiang Qing died by suicide in prison in 1991, a committed Maoist to the very end. By assigning responsibility for the Cultural Revolution's horrors to this small circle of extremists, the party was able to preserve Mao's foundational status as the great helmsman while channeling blame away from the system and the ideology that had made such horrors possible. A politically expedient arrangement that precluded genuine institutional reckoning but allowed the state to move forward without the full weight of collective self-examination. The figure who would most decisively shape the era that followed was Deng Xiaoping, rehabilitated for the second time in July 1977 when Hua appointed him vice chairman of the Communist Party. Now in his early 70s, Deng brought to the task of national reconstruction a rare combination of ideological flexibility, political resilience hardened by personal suffering, and a pragmatism forged through decades of direct experience with the consequences of dogma unchecked by reality. He had witnessed at close range the devastation wrought by years of ideological excess, the ruined economy, the shuttered universities, the persecuted intellectuals, the neglected industrial infrastructure, and a rural population that still earned the equivalent of roughly $40 per year. He understood with clarity that radical reform was not simply desirable but existentially necessary. Deng was prepared to adopt ideas, methods, and technologies from wherever they proved effective, without regard to their ideological origins or associations. He elevated the four modernizations in agriculture, industry, science and technology, and national defense that Zhou Enlai had originally articulated, treating them as the practical framework for national renewal rather than abstract aspirations. He encouraged students and officials to study abroad, breaking decisively with the insularity and xenophobia that had defined the Maoist era. By late 1978, Though formally ranked third within the Politburo, Deng was in practical terms the dominant force in Chinese policymaking, and the reforms he was on the verge of implementing. An economic opening of truly unprecedented scale that would eventually lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and fundamentally alter the structure of the global economy, represented a definitive and irreversible break with the rigid ideological inheritance of the Mao years. Even as the Communist Party maintained its absolute monopoly on political power and sustained its carefully constructed, officially mandated reverence for the man whose legacy it was, in every practical sense, quietly but systematically leaving behind.